Hi, everyone. My name is Alex Pigman. I'm a journalist from Agence France Presse, and I've been very kindly invited by the Dutch permanent representatives in Brussels to moderate this panel, which is titled Disinformation and Democracy, Lessons from America. I think one of the reasons I am moderating this panel is because I'm American, though I work for a French news agency and I also have the French nationality. And the starting point of this panel, of course, is the storming of the Capitol building in Washington on January 6th, which shocked the world. After weeks of disinformation put out by the outgoing President Donald Trump, a motley crew of alt-right hooligans, but not only, stormed the world's greatest symbol of democracy, with many of us thinking that the very fate of the United States was teetering. The event was, let's face it, quite complex, and we'll leave our American friends and the American reporters and think tanks to unravel exactly what happened over there. But at the same time, we were very, very shocked by it here in Europe. We were disturbed by these events because, of course, there was always that lingering feeling that something similar could, and maybe has in smaller ways, happened on our continent here in Europe. And the question is, why is that? The Capitol riot, which we should always remember was a tragic event where there were several dead, was, if you remember, was very weirdly personified by a shirtless man in Viking horns, who, of course, made the scene completely ridiculous, but at the same time kind of gave us a crucial clue to what had taken place. That the men and women, but let's face it, they were mainly men, and maybe we'll get back to that later in the conversation, when they were spoken to, when they were speaking to the media in front of the Capitol, they betrayed something about themselves that I think is important for our discussion today, is that they were just completely divorced from the reality that the mainstream or that the majority of the establishment of society shares. Things like QAnon, the Valhalla, and very obtuse racial theories. All these visions were from these participants, clearly pointed to a vision of the world that did not come from the media that we know, not even Fox News. But, ladies and gentlemen, yes, it probably came from the internet. So in this discussion, I'd like to unpack that alternative reality and see how this disinformation and this alternative reality can affect an election cycle. And of course, this is a crucial question, since in a week's time, the Dutch will be heading to the polls. And one of our guests will be giving us some real great insights on what has to be done, what can be done to better contain a debate. And because he's been working on an arrangement with the Dutch political parties and big tech to make sure that crazy events like happened in the United States don't happen. Then in the fall, the Germans will vote, and we will have a new chancellor, which will be one of the most significant changing of the guards in European politics for a generation. And then next year, in the country, or the European country I know best, French elections will take place. And there are some hot button issues such as religion, Islam, migration, and even the benefits of vaccinations are ready to have a big influence. And of course, those are all topics that do very, very well on social media. So that is sort of the basis of our conversation today. And of course, we will also get to the foreign actors and what their role is, because we all remember 2016, which turned out to be real sort of a crucible year for disinformation. And we'll have a discussion about that as well. So I'll quickly want to get to it. To begin with, I want to introduce my guests. My first guest will be MEP Viola von Cramon from Germany, and she's a member of the INGA Special Committee that was created in 2020 just specifically to discuss disinformation, and especially the role of foreign actors, third-party actors, as we say here, in elections. And then we'll also be speaking with Peter van Aelst, professor from the University of Antwerp. He's a political science, and he's done some very interesting studies on who are the people that are consuming the disinformation and the misinformation. And then finally, we'll be speaking to Sam van der Staak, head of the program Institute for Democracy and Electoral Assistance, which we use the acronym IDEA. And it is he who has organized this incredible code of conduct arrangement in the Netherlands that has, I think, already had pretty profound effects on the election that will be taking place there next week. So I'm going to change things slightly a little bit, and I think that what I'd like to do is to begin with Peter, the professor from Antwerp, mainly because maybe as a starting point, we can discuss exactly what you have discovered in your studies about who and where the disinformation is where the consumers of disinformation and misinformation are. And without them, in a sense, we wouldn't have a problem. So we have a problem because people clearly engage with it. And if you can just open by saying, who are these people?
Okay, thank you. Yes, indeed. So my interest for this topic has started from the US. And for a while, I thought it would be a mainly US problem because it's a highly polarized society, and that we in Europe, with our multi-party system, we would be much more safer for all types of disinformation, which is, I think, still the case. But we see in our research more and more that there is a growing group of people, as you say, that are willing to consume and also unwillingly sometimes spread disinformation. And so if you have a Facebook post about that creates doubt about vaccines, and you note and you like that, or you share that post, then you're part of spreading it. And so it's not only a problem, I think, of who creates it, but also people. Again, sometimes they say, "Oh, it was just for fun that I spread this message," but you're part of the dissemination of it. Who are these people? First to say, so we tested it. So we presented people with what we call somewhat realistic types of disinformation on different topics, on corona, migration, climate change. And we see that, for instance, in a country as Switzerland, about 10% of people would like, share, or comment on such a message. And in countries as Germany, Belgium, it's rather 15%. And then in the US, it's 25%. So that says something about the group of people that is willing to engage with it. So on the good side, you could say the large majority of people would clearly say, okay, this type of messages, I have nothing to do with that. So that's the good news. But still, if you have 10% of the population who is willing to spread it, you can create an enormous stream of information that might be problematic. Who are these people? And of course, this is limitations of research, but some things that come back over and over again. These people are more often male than female, more often lower educated, and more often right wing or extreme right in the political spectrum. Not only, but more often. We also see, but that might be a little bit too complicated. There is a kind of psychological profile attached to it, which might be a little bit complicated to explain, and we're still exploring this. But it seems that sometimes a lack of empathy with other people in general is something that is more common with those people who sometimes we call it, have an appetite for chaos and like to disturb things and mistrust institutions and all that kind of stuff. And then finally, perhaps an important characteristic is that these people are overly active on social media. So, and not only on political stuff, but people who also say in general that they often like stuff and share stuff, that they are just eager to engage with all types of information. It can be pictures of your cat, and so very innocent. But there seems to be, and I think the World Health Organization had a very good campaign recently where they said, stop and pause, like please think for at least 10 seconds about what you're willing to do. especially on the smartphone. Research of colleagues has shown that people spread more information on a smartphone than on a laptop. So that already says something about the speed in which you disseminate problematic or doubtful or misleading information. Yeah, I think these in a nutshell are some of the most important findings.
If I could just have a follow-up question to that, was there anything in your studies that that characterized the type of media and the type of messages that were the most that were the most successful in that in the ones that who do click through them all the time?
Yeah, we've not been that successful in really finding the characteristics of disinformation. For instance, we had the expectation that more sensational with big fonts and pictures and everything that would go more viral, but that does not seem to be the case. So it might also be that very subtle types of disinformation that really resemble news. So we for instance, used the headline news.com, which does not exist, but everybody might think it sounds believable, right? I think especially in the European context, you want to resemble traditional media. I think in the US, they already been a step further and they mistrust traditional media that much that it's almost the opposite. That you don't want to look like an article from the New York Times because these are fake news. But I think in Germany and the Netherlands, you do want to look like this might also be an article of the public broadcaster.
Mm-hmm. That's fair. And now, if I can come to you, Viola, in your committee, it seems to be, which is, disinformation, but has a special focus on foreign actors. And I think that Peter has just described to us like there's a captive audience. And do you think you could say, and then of course expand on whatever you would like, but I mean, do you think you could say that there are foreign actors who are well aware of that captive audience and are doing everything they can to engage them and for them to create as much havoc as possible in our democracies here in the EU?
Yes, for sure. As Peter has said, he has been, let's say, socialized in that topic in the US. I was surely socialized in Eastern Europe. While I've been working in Russia, Ukraine already since '93, I was overwhelmed by, let's say, the media reaction, let's put it very neutral, after the annexation of Crimea and the echo in some of the media especially, but also on social media. While I knew how it happened, the whole Maidan situation and the aftermath, the war in the Donbass and so on and so forth. But in some of the medias, and especially the narratives coming from the Kremlin, it was just the opposite. So they turned around the victim and perpetrator, and so it was really, really difficult to detect and to make sure to push aside the concept of lie or lying and to really come with this, what I could call truth or reality. And so already 2014-15, it was clear there is somebody with a systematic approach to find ways to destabilize our, let's put it, democracies or our societies. And they just jump on each and every topic which might be eligible for this. So, I mean, it was very easy for us, let's say Germans, with our history, with our past, to jump on this Russian narrative on who is the fascist and what is the role of the Russians. And so many people, even from the, let's say, better educated, well-educated people, picked up this Russian narratives. But now it's, of course, not only limited to Russian foreign actors, it's a broader range of people interfering in our public space. And that makes it even more difficult. Because let's say after the annexation of Crimea, Maidan, and the shooting of MH17, which is of course also closely linked then to the Netherlands, that was pretty obvious. So you could really, I mean, follow and trace these narratives and so on. And it was pretty obvious coming mainly from the Kremlin or from Moscow, from the troll factories and so on. But now it's becoming a little bit more difficult. While we have actors also in the European Union, such as Mr. Orban and also Vucic and others, who are easy on picking up these topics. And also, I would say the audience, as Peter has said, is not only limited to this 10 or 15%, but more and more people now have this feeling you cannot trust this media, you cannot trust the institution. I would say 5-6 years ago, there was still a big trust in public broadcasters, in the larger national-wide newspapers and so on. Now we gained some, let's say, territory back in the vaccination time, because people really look for serious information, and also the role of science, of researchers, at least in the German media landscape, it has completely changed. That is a plus on our side. But nevertheless, this systematic approach of destabilizing societies and using different tools and instruments, using the social media channels in all ways, while they have the business model based on this, and we will, I'm sure we will come later to that point. But I would say our main focus is now first to analyze what kind of foreign interference are those? What kind of, let's say, measures and activities are those? How can we strengthen the resilience in a broader sense? And how can we coordinate with what is already existing, for example, on the European level, with the European Disinformation Lab or the Stratcom? This is based in the European External Action Service. But we would like to strengthen the mandate. But I could speak a little bit longer later on in that respect.
Yeah, I mean, just as a follow-up, I mean, do you think that fundamentally, and before I come to Sam, is that do you think fundamentally it's a law and order issue? Because I know that you guys have spoken to like officials from NATO and, you know, security-focused people, or is it a nation issue? I mean, we do have a question from the audience, you know, who's saying that, you know, those who consume this stuff, I mean, let's say this where we're talking about cocaine addiction, is if we could stop people from doing cocaine, then we wouldn't have a cocaine problem. And so I was just wondering, is there, you know, in your committee, are you guys all thinking like, let's get the spooks in here, let's get the geeks like we see in our TV shows and make sure that they go against the trolls? Or is it more on the other side? Is this like, let's try to get people to stop eating this stuff?
Yeah, and therefore we need a clear definition what is actually only harmful and what is, I mean, really systematic disinformation. And so we have different, let's say, terminology: disinformation, malinformation, misinformation, influence of operation. And so it is not only a regulatory question, that's for sure. So we have to work from different angles, but you cannot just, I mean, all of us would like to protect the freedom of media and freedom of press in a way. I mean, even maybe we have a different relationship towards that than it is in the US or in Great Britain, but nevertheless, this is one of our highest value in the European Union, and we have to make sure we do not decrease the space in a way which is then again harmful for all kind of independent media. So this is a very fine line to walk on.
Right. Sam, I'll come to you now because it's a really good case that you can present to us right now. Netherlands going into a vote next week. And you got all the parties, or most of the parties, but not all, and hopefully you can give us a little bit of a detail on that, and all of the big tech companies, but not all, to sort of agree on a code of conduct to get through this elections without, you know, with being vigilant to disinformation. I was just wondering if you could just describe the scene for us.
Yeah, no, thanks very much. Thanks to the organizers, the Netherlands Perm Rep. I fully agree with what's been said, especially Viola. You said, well, we have to go beyond regulation, because the problem is not just the hardcore disinfo anymore, right? What we've seen over the past years is that the lines have been blurred between the hardcore disinfo and things that are more political speech, political opinion, that are circulating on online media, that people are sharing, amplifying. And that gray zone of what is really disinfo, what is misinformation, so not intentional, what is political opinion, is just growing. And so what we try to do is to say, okay, if all of that cannot be captured in law and regulations, as Viola also said, then let's see if we can try and capture, at least in sort of a voluntary way, what political parties and tech platforms find important. And so this was an initiative by the parliament itself, and via the Ministry of the Interior in the Netherlands, they asked us to do this. We came up with a list of 25 commitments where parties and platforms say, this is behavior that we find important for the elections. We know that there's regulation upcoming from the European level, but the elections are taking place before that, and pending that, this is what we're going to do. And the things including transparency of ads. All parties are posting ads at the moment, even more so than before, because due to COVID, a lot of the campaigns are moving online. So let's be transparent. Let's not do things that we all know are not allowed. Fake accounts, using bots, accepting foreign funding. A lot of the things that we saw through not just foreign interference, has been mentioned, but also the Cambridge Analytica scandal, that rocked the 2016 US elections and the Brexit debate. So we try to put all these things that are now occupying that gray zone between the hardcore disinfo and all the other, other elements of what we're now seeing as being problematic in online campaigning, and said, this is what we should do. And then, yeah, indeed, most parties signed up, especially those at the center. And the three biggest platforms that do paid online advertisement, plus TikTok. So we were very happy, and we can discuss why others not.
But I mean, if I could just before, I mean, I don't want to get into a regulation discussion, but there's a slight interesting question I'd like to ask you that will pertain to that, is that from your experience of dealing with the Dutch election coming up, I mean, do you feel like addressing disinformation in all its different confusing and complex guises is best done specifically on an election and on a national sphere? Or do you see a strong place for EU-wide regulation, legislation to control these things? Because I mean, a French election is a very different animal than a Dutch election.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, no, definitely, and that's exactly what you're seeing. There's also different cultures, right? Political cultures. France has a much more intervening tradition of legislating how its political life is organized, whereas the Dutch and the Nordic approach is much more laissez-faire. I think there will be European legislation, perhaps even broader than that, right? And I think it's important that the EU and the US somehow harmonize their approaches, because the markets are so fast. But beyond that regulation, I think at national level, you will need additional rules, if only because the EU, lacks the competences to intervene in the rules of politics at the member state level. That's the battle that's being fought at the moment. But from past experience, you'll probably see that member states will say, "Hold on, the way we organize our political parties is something that we'll deal with ourselves." So you will have 27 national discussions, national debates. And what we've seen in the past, that's to do with political history, how your political culture is organized, but also how advanced you are in using, the online sphere in your campaigns. And you see huge differences between North and South, East and Western Europe. When you have discussions with the countries like Romania, you just get a completely different response on how the online sphere is interfering in their elections than when you talk to Sweden.
Right. Peter, if I could come back to you, I was just wondering, in the studies that you made and you narrowed down this audience, I mean, obviously there's always variety, even in when things are being defined, but is your feeling as a researcher and from having given this a lot of thought, do you feel like we can address this audience and maybe change patterns of behavior, or what would be the ways to sort of to redefine a little bit how they approach politics and being online and going viral and getting the chat rooms going like crazy?
Yeah, very good question, and I will clearly disappoint in my answer because it's of course very tricky. As a next step, we want to try different kind of solutions in our studies, and for instance, fact checking. For instance, there's a lot of debate now: is fact checking really working? Does it backfire? Do people actually read it, etc.? I still believe, for instance, in something like fact checking, not so much to reach these people directly, but I think that in countries as Belgium, the Netherlands, Germany, it still has an effect on politicians. So if politicians are aware that, for instance, now during the Dutch election, that journalists are doing regular fact checkings, even better if there would be an independent institute that fact checks them, they adjust their behavior. I'm not so optimistic that you can go to that 15% of people and say, okay, now we're gonna educate you and take away your partisan media and you will walk in line again. So that will not happen. I think if we, in our studies, we see that there often are very structural reasons behind this behavior. I mentioned polarization. It's clearly, we see that in societies that are more polarized, it's harder, or people are less resilient to disinformation. So, and something as polarization is hard to take away. That might take a few generations. So I think some of the real causes are structural and are underlying. And Viola said something about trust in institutions, respect for these institutions. You don't bring that back tomorrow. So that will require a long-term strategy, fact-checking, media literacy, and a few other things. And I think the initiative that is just being spelled out are good examples of things trying to do in the short run. I think also involving the platforms. We've seen with the European elections that Facebook, because of what happened in the US, did an extra effort. And well, I'm not always a big Facebook fan from the company has too much power, but in certain respects, they did more. They can improve, I think, what they are doing, but they did more than a lot of people expected and kept the problem, at least during elections. It's the funny thing that elections are very important, crucial moments in our democracy, but then everybody is focused on politics. And perhaps disinformation is bigger when we're not all watching, or more related to certain issues and not to the elections as a whole.
Right.
Yeah, some of my thoughts.
Yeah, no, that's very interesting. Viola, I was thinking, because you described Eastern Europe, I think I saw a recent tweet of yours, about Serbia and where it's the main broadsheets or it's the main newspapers that are doing the disinformation. And
Exactly.
we rely, or the YouTubes and the Facebooks provide some of what we want, some of the type of media stories that we're hoping to be carried in these countries. So it's the opposite of what we have, let's say, in the western part of the continent. I'm thinking of Navalny as well in Russia, where his famous videos that expose all sorts of things that are celebrated in many parts of European Parliament and all over Western Europe are on YouTube. While in countries like the United States or in Western countries, we worry about the YouTube rabbit holes that take you to increasingly extreme content. that YouTube has said that they've fixed or are working on. I was just wondering how do you say that? I'm thinking of Burma as well, actually, of Myanmar. I mean, in Myanmar, where all that's happening there is probably taking place on social media against the ruling parties. So in some European countries, they're with us, and in others, they're against us. So just wondering how you make sense of all that.
Yeah, well, the situation in Central and Eastern Europe, especially where we have already almost an autocratic regime, such as Prime Minister Orban, and also the state capturing in case of the Czech Republic, make our life really difficult. And I think what Commissioner Jourova has proposed in her Democracy Action Plan.
Viola, are you still there?
I'm sorry, I don't know what I did, but
You're back
wireless.
now.
Yeah, I'm sorry. So the Democracy Action Plan actually proposed it's a three pillar structure. One is how to counter disinformation. One is how to strengthen qualitative journalism, and the third one is how to prevent external actors to intervene in our elections. And when we have cases, as you have mentioned, where actually the state media is the main route or source for disinformation, I guess it would be necessary to have also like a board, any kind of an institution within the European Committee who would ask for more pluralism, for Sorry, I don't know what to do here. That's kind of annoying.
Okay. You're back.
Go back.
Pluralism. You're so yeah.
Yeah, so what we have to do is, on one hand, of course, make sure that we protect and that we ensure the freedom of media and the freedom of press, and on the other hand, have a clear either code of conduct or regulation, more support for independent and critical media, which is sometimes really difficult to disperse the money. What we have seen now in Hungary and other countries where journalists are physically attacked, they are blackmailed, they're under pressure constantly. So even if we would like to give more financial support to NGOs or to think tanks, to analytic capacities, this is with the help of state authorities, sometimes even impossible. And there I see that the EU should have a saying on making sure that this media pluralism is somehow guaranteed, and this media freedom is also seconded with the help from the European Union. And I think that the Democracy Action Plan could be a good tool for this. When it comes, one more point where I disagreed with one of the colleagues from the panel, I think we need a clear regulatory framework when it comes to party financing. We really have to have a clear indication that we should limit all kind of external financing of parties, donations from companies, from third actors. We have now the case where, for example, a foundation from Switzerland financed partly the right-wing party in Germany with obviously the help from an external actors and so on and so forth. So we can prove this through the party internal audits, but this come only in place like after 2 years. So when the German Bundestag published this one, but this is from our perspective much too late. So we need a different system which checks in a more regular sense the party donation, party financing, and can quickly interact or react to this kind of additional and maybe intransparent financing or donations.
And to be clear, you're saying something on the European level, like that's something that, there'd be a level playing field for those type of rules for political parties across Europe, EU 27.
Exactly. This should be in place, and in the Inga committee, we are really working on any kind of a structure what would be hopefully then to be applied in all member states.
I'll bring that notion to you, Sam. What do you think of that? Very simply.
I think it's brilliant, and I'd love to see that. The question I raised is it feasible, right? So we know that interfering in member state electoral rules or political finance or political parties rules is traditionally, a member state affair. Of course, you can regulate for the European political parties, but Viola, you're very right. There will always be loopholes. If you don't regulate the national level, then at national level, parties can still accept money from abroad, from Russia and China and wherever. They can channel that back to the European parties. So even if you do regulate European parties and say you can no longer receive money from abroad, there's loopholes that they can exploit. So I agree with you that it's necessary. I'm just wondering, is it feasible?
I think that Greco has made already some proposals on this, and it would be already sufficient if we could discuss this more seriously than we have done this in the past, for example.
Yeah, of course. Sorry, moderator, please let me know if I should shut up. But Greco, of course, is a peer mechanism, right? It just exposes what is happening and it makes recommendations, but it has no power to regulate. So it does fantastic work. We have, we keep track of what countries have bans on foreign donations. About 2/3 of European countries do, 1/3 do not. Again, it's the traditionally more laissez-faire countries in Northern Europe and Western Europe that don't have it because they rely on transparency and openness and self-regulation. So we know where the problem sits. It's more a political willingness at the member state level to say, let's collectively do something about it. So I think we all share the same objective. It's more about how do we get there.
I have a question from someone who's listening, and it's I like it a lot. Basically, since Trump was thrown off of Twitter, the world is a quieter place. And that's a funny thing to say, but at the same time, it's very true. And I was just wondering, what is the role? How would you say what is the role of Twitter in terms of being able to shoot back at the media and at headlines, been in the disinformation debate? Maybe I'll start with you, Viola, since this is your profession. I was just wondering if maybe if politicians were told they can no longer have Twitter and Facebook, what would happen?
Well, since this, whoever took the decision whoever was responsible for this on Twitter, this is, of course, not very democratic, legitimized. And on one hand, you're right. We are happy that's a quieter world, and we can enjoy this. But on the other hand, if Twitter changes his internal policy and will just shut up other, let's say, parts of the political spectrum, this would be very disputable. So we would like to see a different way of regulating this big tech and platforms. And this is, as I think Peter has said at the beginning, we need something where we go in line with the US, where we have, let's say, a joint approach how to regulate this, and also how to, let's say, change the business model of Twitter. The polarization is, of course, also in that extent now, while this is highly beneficial for platforms and for, Facebook and Twitter and so on. So every emotional tweet brings much more traffic, brings much more clicks and the opportunity to do this advertising. And so in that respect, I think some of my colleagues here in the group would like to see to change the entire business model of Twitter and Facebook. Whether this is feasible, I cannot tell you, but at least there's an intention and there's an ambition to do so and to try and to look for majorities.
Do you believe in the gatekeeper concept, like that there are certain companies that just are too important that they become these public utilities that need to be regulated like a big bank, like a Deutsche Bank or Barclays?
Yes, I guess that's the hope for the Digital Service Act, that we can agree on something like this, because this is not just any private company. This is, let's say, dominating our public space in a way which cannot be left to one decision on Twitter or Facebook. And so it needs definitely more regulation in that respect.
Sam, you've just finished, I guess, taking a lot of meetings with all these companies. I was just wondering if you could just describe the experience a little bit in terms of trying to set something up.
No, there's definitely, my experience is a lot of interest in and concern that things will change drastically, right? I guess all platforms are in a wait and see modus, and a lot of them were hesitant to come on board with a national level code of conduct because they fear that once they say yes to the Netherlands, then tomorrow they'll have to do the same for Germany, and then for France, and then for Sweden, and all the elections that are upcoming. And so I think it's primarily that fear of having a very scattered framework that they then have to employ all these people to make this puzzle work of all these different member states. I think they're actually welcoming to having a European one-size-fits-all model. So I think Twitter and the likes of them are not against regulation. They are pro clarity. And then, of course, there's going to be discussion about what exactly is going to be in that new regulation. But I think the most important point is that now finally there's consensus that something's going to have to be regulated upon. And ultimately, we'll get the size of politics and platforms to agree on something, which is a good starting point. I think we have to be careful, though, that as we saw, and Viola and Peter mentioned it early on, there will be impact on the rest of the world, right? There's, the countries like Russia, Ukraine are very different than what you see within the EU. And even within the EU, as was mentioned, there's enormous differences. And, you have this GDPR model where you see that, legislation that was designed for the EU has now become the blueprint for the whole world. You speak to people from anywhere from Sri Lanka to Colombia that say, thank you for the GDPR, Europe, because now all of a sudden, in our countries, we have privacy laws because companies are adhering to it out of sort of self-protection. It's an enormous impact that the GDPR has had. And I think we're going to see the same for this discussion on regulating platforms, right? The standard that the EU will introduce will become the global standard. But because, as we just learned from Viola and Peter, the situation is not the same in Ukraine as it is in Germany. Will those EU rules fit? And I think we're going to have to look around us a little bit to make sure that we're not creating a monster that works for us, but doesn't work for the rest of the world.
Or doesn't work within the EU 27, because I guess this will all, pass by QMV at the end of the day. And if, there might be some people that are seriously unhappy and feel that it's completely inadapted to their own systems when it is finally decided sometime in the future. Maybe I come back to you, Peter, do you think, as our academic here, and having studied these issues, what's your feeling, generally speaking, in 2021? May have changed since 2016 when you first started thinking about these things. What's your thinking of, as we say in France, les GAFA and of big tech on these issues? Do you think that they are really taking the lessons to heart, or is there still that virality that they need so much and that the shareholders and funds in Europe want to have, so that the profits still keep coming in? I mean, which is it?
Well, the problem is I think on different levels. On the one hand, I agree what has been said, that big tech is not against regulation if they have a sort of framework where they can say, okay, these extremists, we're going to throw them off, and not these. Even they might think that is helpful. The bigger challenge, I think, for me is on the one hand transparency, and they did things on that. Like, we know that Facebook has the ad library, so we can see what all the political parties are doing in terms of advertisements. But an even bigger challenge is the algorithm. So if I talked about polarization, and a lot of their algorithms give people more of the same so that you stay on the platform. And that goes against their business model to change that. And it's hard to regulate, to say to a company, we don't want you to be as good as you are anymore. We want you to let go people sooner. I'm not sure how to explain this, but you know what I mean. It's about something about addiction, and it's something about locking people up in some sort of echo chamber. And that is, again, a deeper problem that we won't solve with removing Trump and a few others.
Right. I mean, but then I was thinking, you have the big tech, but then you have like the big elephants in the room who are the leaders. And sometimes, the room is literally the summit room of the egg of the Europa building. We refer to Viktor Orban, and now we have the Slovenian prime minister who will be taking over the EU presidency in a couple of months. And I was just thinking, Viola, can any of these things that you're discussing in your committee, I feel like Russia is clearly, there's this report that came out from the EAS where Russia is just having its fun sending all sorts of nonsense to Germany, especially because Vladimir Putin loves Germany. But yet we got to talk to Vlad. The diplomats, the leaders don't want to engage him. And don't want to. I feel like there's a lack of connection between these between the hybrid warfare that's clearly taking place. I mean, Macron, for example, like there clearly was a hybrid warfare, cyber attacks and disinformation attacks against him personally, but yet got to talk to the man. And I feel like there's a similar situation with Orban, which is like, I dare say in your political group, with the EPP, which is, it's like he's doing these horrible things now until very recently. But it's, you can't mess up with things. Politics of it are very touchy. And I was just sort of, when can those two things connect, or are they connecting now?
That's difficult to say. I think it was a good decision finally to kick out the Fidesz party from EPP, even it was 10 years too late, but nevertheless, it happened. But this would not solve the problem of disinformation and destabilization societies in the European Union, for sure. What I see with Russia, there's some kind of a special relationship, and all of the, let's say, leaders in Europe would like to have any kind of a dialogue with him. I don't know what this temptation, why is it so important if you have somebody who has caused 600,000 deaths in Syria, 15,000 deaths in Ukraine, and so on. And you see this every frozen conflict is caused by Russia. And still, and we have, you have mentioned the last publication from the External Action Service, but this is still in English, some parts are in German, but it is still, let's say, consumed and perceived by a very small people of analysts and specialists. And I am really lobbying for dispersing this information to regional newspaper in all 20, 3 official languages every week. So what should happen? We need to disperse the information which are gathered here and which are well prepared, but which mainly keep, let's say, in the insider circle. And this is surely not enough. So people in Eastern Germany, for example, still dream of the good old times and have this kind of Stockholm syndrome, dreaming of the strong leader, but not having this, let's say, confrontation with reality. Yeah. And also, what I'm facing now with this approval of Sputnik V, this is unbelievable. And it is really important to tell the people, hey, there is no independent clinical trial in Russia. So we cannot approve taking the empirical data from Russia and approve that thing here. But what does Mr. Borrell do in Moscow? Praising it in front of everyone. How can you do this? So as you said, there's a complete mismatch. I mean, he was well prepared before he left Brussels. And then it was a complete disaster at the press conference. How can he do this? I mean, behind the doors, he was admitting that it was a disaster and that he had openly talked to Sergei Lavrov, and that's why he bluntly attacked him during the press conference. But at the press conference, you cannot really see what is the EU reaction on this. Why is he appearing so weak? And this is exactly what you're saying. I would have said at the press conference, okay, Sergei, if this is the style and the way of working together, thanks a lot, I'm going to leave. It's up to you to do the rest of this business. But nobody does that. They are getting humiliated by the Russian authorities, by the Russian government, by Putin himself. And so as long as you accept that, they're going to continue. And they think that's the right way of handling it. And of course, this is also what the Russian domestic audience perceive as, okay, that's how the West is being treated by us. And so they think this is a kind of, I don't know, the way of behavior, and Russia is accepted as an international partner.
We can ask maybe, Sam, I mean, is from what you're seeing, not only in the Netherlands, but in other countries that you've worked with or are studying and taking a closer look at, where are we today in 2021 on the role of foreign actors in elections? In, just objectively speaking, have things improved since 2016 when the troll farms are going full hilt?
Well, I guess I'd love to hear also Peter's views on this, because he knows probably much more than I do. But what I think we've seen since 2016, when this first surfaced, right, in the first Trump campaign, is that a lot of the problem has not gone away, but a lot of the techniques that we saw done by foreign actors are now also done by domestic actors, right? So in 2020, the U.S. elections, a lot of the debate on disinformation and third-party funding, a lot of that debate was actually done by domestic actors, and so basically we've borrowed from the Russians or from foreign forces, and and started using their techniques at home. And so what I think is important is that we learn from that lesson, right? So we know that certain things that are starting with fringe actors become the norm after a couple of years, and that we act quickly enough to make sure that we don't legislate for yesterday's affair. Right now, I think the EU has taken it seriously that there is such a thing as foreign interference, and it's set up its mechanisms and its monitoring and its fact-checking, and it's talking about legislation. But of course, the bus has moved. The bus has left and moved to the new actors, new techniques, and we have to legislate for tomorrow's problem, and that's eternally difficult. But I think we're currently, fighting yesterday's war a little bit too much. So I think that's the challenge for the EU. How are we preparing ourselves for an incredibly rapidly developing field, right? And that's the whole problem with ICT and politics. Eternally as soon as you hone in on the problem has morphed into something else because IT moves and develops so quickly.
That's exactly the point that I would jump on. And for you, Peter, I mean, both in answering the same question and maybe in thinking like, if these forces are still existing, how can technology how can we keep up with the technology? And is technology maybe sometimes a solution, do you think?
Well, yeah, not always, I think. I want to react to Viola when she talked about Sputnik. And it looks very professional as a traditional source of information. And I was giving a talk for NATO, and I was preparing myself and looking at some of their news broadcasts. And I found a story about Belgian soldiers who did not have warm clothes in the winter. And I thought, I have this nice example of a fake story that they do on Sputnik. And I Googled it, and I found out it's actually correct. And it was a completely correct story. There was a problem. So what they do is they're so highly selective and look for stories that embarrass Western NATO, in this case, troops. So it's so subtle. So how it's not a troll farm that you can attack and yet you can dismantle. It's much more subtle. And talking about Putin and Russia, I think their main aim is creating doubt. Conflict and doubt. So some people say, Putin wanted Trump to win. I'm not sure he's really interested in Trump. It's creating doubt that the democratic system does not work well. And he's highly successful in the US in showing that that there's a lot of conflict and doubt. And I must say, I struggle a lot with that idea of doubt because also in science, doubt is important. We should not believe everything. So I used to tell my students, don't believe everything you see in the news. It's not 100% correct. Be critical. And now I have to tell them the opposite. Right. Most of what you see on television news is true. And it's a bit frightening that I have to tell my students at university that. So there's something has been changing. Yeah.
No, but I mean, do your students, I mean, if you felt like what disinformation would your students be the most vulnerable to, the ones that are, 25 and under? Like, which is TikTok something that they, is this like, should we not be worrying about Facebook? What should we be worrying about for them?
Yeah, it's a tricky question. I see political parties now entering TikTok because they can reach even younger non-voters, but get their ideas out there. I think that's highly dangerous. And if you want to regulate something, then keep political parties away from TikTok, I would say, and also showing ads to people below 16, etc. I think that is highly dangerous because they don't have a framework. When I see in Europe, I don't think it's the campaigns like Donald Trump and Stop the Steal. That would not work in a European context. Again, as I said, it's much more subtle. It's what I noticed with my students is not so much disinformation, but the high selectivity. So political parties spread ads where they show you one quote from a political debate, their best quote. And then another party shows their quote. And at the end, you have the idea that you're informed. So my students say, I follow the news via Facebook. But we see over and over again in the research, you don't learn from social media. Perhaps the four of us do, and part of this audience does, because you do something extra on social media. You take an extra article from The Guardian, etc. But most people who claim to be informed via social media score very low on knowledge tests. So, and that I see as in for my students, not that they would believe conspiracy QAnon theories, but that they have the impression that they're informed, and which often they are not.
No, something very superficial that doesn't have any sort of real
intellectual
depth to it.
You scroll through your feed, and you have the idea that you've been informed.
Yeah.
So I make a lot of I make a lot of advertisements to watch the evening news again, which I never watch myself because
Yeah.
I'm watching news the whole day. But I think it's important for people to stick to old-fashioned news. Yeah,
Yeah.
I'm getting older
In
and I'm getting more supporter of traditional media. Yeah.
in France, they call the 8 o'clock news la grande messe. You know, it's the daily mass where you sit down
Yeah.
and I know I think people in Germany always watch, like, there's that news that some at some time of day that there's a actual where everyone watches the evening news. And which used to exist in the United States, but no longer does. But look, I think what we've used up our time here, and I know that everyone is busy schedules, and I just want to thank again the Dutch permanent Rails for inviting me to moderate this panel and to have you guys here. I found it really fun. I hope the people listening in from wherever found it fun and interesting as well. And I think on that note, we can leave it right there. So again, thank you, big thank you to all my panelists. And this issue will be, will be with us for, I think, a long, long time to come. All right, thank you so much, guys.
Okay.
Thanks a lot.
Thank you.